There's a ubiquitous phenomenon in gaming YouTube where even small games from independent studios often get videos made about them with titles like The Real Meaning of Such and Such, or Whatever It Is, Explained, trying to wrap up all the lore together with a bright red bow in a way that seems definitive. Despite being one of the most widely written about and most critically regarded art house games of all time, Kentucky Route Zero's YouTube presence is mercifully and astonishingly devoid of these sorts of videos. I think this is a sign of how truly effective Kentucky Route Zero was and what it was trying to be, an abstracted, artistically kaleidoscopic road trip along a highway that doesn't exist into the heartbreaks and pains of a country that does. Most of the time, Kentucky Route Zero doesn't feel at all like a game. It feels like theater, it feels like a poem, and for long portions of itself it actually is poetry and theater explicitly. Its art style has an angular, low-poly quality to it, but it's used to such stunning effect so frequently that it's impossible to call it minimalist or retro. Kentucky Route Zero is a multimedia art experience that gives its allegiance to no single medium, no single style. There's an odd game called Katamari Damacy where your goal is to roll a sticky ball across a landscape and make that ball as large as possible with a supernatural adhesive. If you took a Katamari ball and rolled it through a college library, then a computer museum, then out of town to the outskirts where the one-room bars and crumbling gas stations are, and then on down the road across hundreds of miles of lonely American blacktop in the middle of the night, you might end up with something that superficially resembles Kentucky Route Zero, but it still wouldn't be quite right. It's got 5 acts released across a 7-year period with a further 5 interlude chapters, each of them intensely and deliberately different than the others. Those differences end up creating a cumulative whole that is never thematically off topic, no matter how it zigs and zags in its presentation, medium, or mode. Like a poem, it implies much more than it ever explicitly says, suggests connections outside of what's shown, and how those implications and suggestions filter down through the audience is so personal and so individualized that any concrete, definitive interpretation of Kentucky Route Zero becomes completely unworkable. Important plot threads end vaguely, incredible images flickered for just moments. The difference between what is errata and what are key plot detail is constantly in a meandering flux. In other words, if you ever happen to see a video titled The Real Ending to Kentucky Route Zero Explained, this video will have already missed the point. The real ending to Kentucky Route Zero might come when you've been driving all night and see the sun come up, and in that slow creeping of orange and gold, the game replays itself for you in your mind. It might come 10 years from now when you're sitting alone in the heat with a half-drunk bottle of something in front of you at 2 in the afternoon, and you get a nagging feeling like you've been this person, seen this person in a different way, sometime long ago. It might come 40 years from now when you try to get out of bed and sit back down again because the pain in your leg is so sharp, and then you envision that leg in an electric yellow. It might be when you're dead and in the ground and aren't much good for remembering anything anymore. Like all art, it endures by sticking with you in some way, by seeing your world reflected in it, and in that reflection trying to see yourself more clearly than usual. Great art is that which stays with you the longest, which rides along with you in the backseat of your imagination, flipping through a magazine and smoking an occasional cigarette. It ends when you stop carrying it with you, when it fades from your memory and self and no longer speaks to you in a way that matters. In this way, explaining the ending of Kentucky Route Zero is easy. It's explaining the rest of it that is such an intimidating task. On that subject, Kentucky Route Zero is best when you don't know much about it going in. I waited all 7 years until it was done to play it, avoiding spoilers, and in the process, avoiding the discourse too, and that, in the end, felt like the right choice. Listening to me resorting the order of things and getting the greasy fingerprints of my own anecdotes, comparisons, and perspectives all over it isn't the way that Kentucky Route Zero is meant to go down for you. If you have an interest in it, please play it first. I'll still be here to talk about it when you get back. I say this not because of the usual reasons, spoilers, but because of how the density of the art and the vagueness of the details will make an encounter with the game necessarily personal. It would be a disservice to the game to have you watch this video and then go out and say, Kentucky Route Zero is this or that, when you haven't figured out yet if it means anything to you. In the game, nearly every dialogue branches out 2 or 3 or 4 directions, and not to split the plot or pivot the events of the world, but just to color in the inviolable black and white outlines of the characters. Who can even say that I conceived the characters to be the same people that you did? Either is valid. I'll tell you what I thought about it and shuffle it around into a shape that I can talk about without getting completely tongue-tied, but the game exists outside of anything that I could say about it in a way that is much closer to poetry than video games. Like, the epilogue slides of Fallout 2 will vary hugely from person to person, and those differences will still be less substantial than how this game emotionally hits different people, what characterizations and conclusions a person might arrive at in the end with Kentucky Route Zero. Fallout 2's epilogue slides are more concretely detailed, more straightforwardly rewarding in a narrative sense, but narrative is the sole format that they're grounded in. Kentucky Route Zero is evocative, associative. It comes at every one of its emotional climaxes indirectly, often making them an actual surprise, and frequently coming off in ways where it's hard to even articulate why such a simple presentation is able to provoke such strong emotions, or the shape that those emotions take. The common accusation you'd throw at a game like that is pretentious, where the pretense is that the game would try and posture itself as being smart and arty as a cover for being mechanically simple, and what fools people must be to accept reading text and feeling things about it to be an acceptable substitute for gameplay organized around a fail-state. This is a common misunderstanding about poetry in general, really. The idea that a poem only matters if it's trying to be profound, and anyway, it's somehow a little twee and irritating for a poem to go around assuming it's profound in the first place. The thing about poetry is that it's only ever about communication, about taking a feeling or an idea that's so massive that it's hard to articulate and trying to condense it down in a way where someone else can get it anyway, by setting a small scene or elaborating on a passing observation or being playful with the format of the words so the way in which you read those words affects your feelings about them. Poems affect people in profound ways, more often because of what they don't say than what they do, because they illuminate or tie together something that feels significant in a person. Poems themselves are often very simple, a lot more simple than the reputation they get as something you have to study to understand. Gary Snyder, for example, is an extremely famous American poet who's known for his eye for the natural world and its collision with rural American life. In high school, you might have run across a poem of his called Hay for the Horses, which goes, "He had driven half the night from far down San Joaquin through Mariposa, up the dangerous mountain roads, and pulled in at 8 a.m. with his big truckload of hay behind the barn. With winch and ropes and hooks, we stacked the bales up clean to splintery redwood rafters. High in the dark, flecks of alfalfa, whirling through shingle cracks of light, itch of hay dust in the sweaty shirt and shoes. At lunchtime, under black oak, out in the hot corral, the old mare nosing lunch pails, grasshoppers crackling in the weeds. I'm 68, he said. I first bucked hay when I was 17. I thought that day I started I sure would hate to do this all my life, and damn it, that's just what I've gone and done." You don't need any kind of education at all to understand that poem. You might even find it a little underwhelming if you're of the camp that expects poetry to spend much energy justifying itself. But that's fine, because all it wants to do is set this tiny scene with its two characters and say it's one thing. Except that it isn't really any one thing, is it? It's a punchline poem, but all those little details build a sympathy, so it's a sad joke if it is one. It's about how time is slippery, our lives more out of our control than we care to admit. It's simple and straightforward in terms of what's right in front of you, but open-ended enough that it can provoke a much more complex inner response. It's communicated more than it's explicitly said. That's all it needs to do to qualify as poetry. If you felt something, it worked. Same with paintings and the visual arts, same with theater and the performing arts, same with games and the digital arts. Kentucky Route Zero pretty much kicks off with a poem, and it illustrates brilliantly what makes the cross-medium artistry of the game so special. Your controlled character is an old fella named Conway who's trying to take a delivery of antique furniture to a place on 5 Dogwood Drive, except the address does not seem to exist. He pulls into a gas station where, after getting the power back on, the attendant lets him use the computer to try and look up the address. He can't remember the computer password, though, because he usually just feels it out, types it out by muscle memory. The attendant says, "It's kind of long, kind of like a short poem, I think. One of those short poems that really sums it all up. You'll figure it out." You then get 3 choices of poetry lines 3 times over, and whatever you choose is the right password. Some of the options are just images, some seem to reference details quite personal to Conway that you don't know yet. Either way, one of your first major acts as player is to sum up a thing you don't know the shape of yet and let that guide you. It's cyclical, it's surreal, it incorporates the audience as their own sort of unaddressed character, just like the whole rest of the game is going to be. It's especially interesting considering the length of the game's development. The creators themselves were also in the position of trying to set up and sum up a thing that had not yet revealed itself in full to them yet. My Conway's poem turned out to say, "I talk and listen to him talking. Nobody saw the accident. It will only get later." It's a short poem, but you know it really sums it all up. I can apply that poem a half dozen different ways to what comes after it, and it's just one of further dozens of valid combinations. In games, a choice like this would typically either have a narrative or a mechanical purpose associated with it. It would be a choice circled back to, or referenced, or rewarded later. Or else a puzzle with a correct solution. Here, it's neither. It is never mentioned again, and any response is fine. What purpose, then? To incorporate the audience into the art, to ask you which of these equally weighted, inconsequential choices felt more correct than another, to provoke a reflection on why one felt better, to give the audience a certain artistic complicity that will bind them to all that's yet to occur. After all, you were the one who summed it all up. Isn't your goal from here out to reconcile those 3 lines with the rest of it? Kentucky Route Zero is on the shorter side for games at 10 hours, but extremely long along those exact same metrics as a stage performance, poetry reading, or gallery showing. If it is poetry, it is an epic poem. If it's a stage play, it's a colossal production. It is an intensely dense and intricate artistic object, something Kentucky Route Zero diffuses by being a disarmingly simple video game. Kentucky Route Zero is a road trip game in its frame and its structure, where Conway's quest for 5 Dogwood Drive will twist from the byways and county lanes of Kentucky all the way down to the Zero, a twisting loop of road that changes depending on where and how you switch direction. It's the geographic equivalent of the magic trick with the interlocking rings. Most of the gamified elements serve to reinforce the strange sense of wonder in space that the minimalist exploration is trying to evoke. Twisting along the roads, either overland or underland, are things to see that don't qualify as entire scenes, just little snippets of something strange or beautiful or banal. It's incredibly important to gamify these elements because there's no truly vivid communicative way to translate the experience of being happily lost into passive media, to fully share the sense of anticipation for what's around the curve and the puzzlement of what you find there. You can make that relatable in passive media, you can make it descriptive and enthralling, and it still won't match up to how easily a simulation can creatively echo these experiences. Consider, there's something like 24 optional encounters outside the main scenes in Act 1, more in Acts 2 and 3, and then none from then on as the structure of the game shifts. If this was a written work, those would have to be layered in. How would you do it? There's the choice of sequencing, the problem of how repetitive it would feel to have one after another of those in straight prose. Diffused into the broader map and the tangle of roads both real and impossible, the player chooses to pursue them or not, to go where they need to go, or to take some looping detours. It makes the interval of their pacing intentional and welcome by design. It gives the player credit for these discoveries. It involves the player in the mood and the moment, without simply conveying a remembrance of those moments. There's a fragmentary quality to them that feels very faithful to real-life road discoveries, where you're always a day late and a dollar short when it comes to finding context or clarity. Even things that explain themselves to you on the road, that are labeled with plaques and signs, are just fleeting reactions against the forces of entropy and chaos. A paragraph or two about a person or a battle or a house while the wind blows over the grasses and the dirt that buried them long ago. A profile of optimism or creativity whose fruits lay mouldering and maggot-eaten before you, or something more inexplicable, a golf cart discarded deep in the woods, a giant leering statue of the Muffler Man appearing in the headlights from fog and darkness, an intersection on a dirt road that reads, River of No Return Wilderness Area. None of those latter examples are from the game, they're things I've seen on my own trips. What you find scattered around the map in Kentucky Route Zero are equally eclectic, but increasingly surreal and magical as the game goes into its deeper acts. The game is a prominent, striking example of magical realism, a literary subgenre that began in Latin America that uses fantastical elements to intensify or lyrically illustrate more human-focused stories. The genre fiction version is often called urban fantasy. Magical realism defines itself instead by leaning into emotional realism, by focusing far more on micro details of character and mood than macro details of plot and world building. Kentucky Route Zero is more a part of that tradition than nearly any other game I've ever seen, and many games this past decade have been dipping a toe into the waters of magical realism. None of them have hewed so closely, so academically, to the original definition of the subgenre. It's in these little optional snippets that the magical part can truly shine through, because when it comes to the characters, the realism part tends to overwhelm the magic with a weight of regret. The amount of gamification there is outside the road-tripping mechanics is generally in the style of old LucasArts-era point-and-click adventure games. Except instead of the colorful art and perpetual jokesterism of the LucasArts era, the art is muted and the jokes are all tremendous downers. There are no puzzles to solve. Each scene is just a scene, with differing amounts of dialogue and props. The gameplay is simple because being any more than what it is wouldn't serve Kentucky Route Zero's purpose, wouldn't communicate anything with any more clarity. The gameplay is simple in the same way that the narrative is simple example in Snyder's Hay for the Horses. It just doesn't need to be any more complicated than it is to convey its message. The mechanical parts of the game and the narrative parts of the poem is just the structure that the art grows on, like tomato vines growing on a trellis. The larger ideas need some kind of concrete support, a defined lattice, to grow healthily and express themselves completely, even if they appear chaotic within the lattice. Looking at Kentucky Route Zero purely as a game, it feels easy to talk about the things that are missing, like, hey, it's an adventure game by format, why not have an inventory and inventory-driven puzzles? Ask this: what would puzzles contribute thematically? There are things you have the power to solve with concrete, explicit solutions. For the storytelling that Kentucky Route Zero wants to do, that's not just useless, but actively counterproductive. Even the serotonin hit from solving a puzzle would distance the player from the melancholy fog of the game's mood. The things that it's omitted were omitted because they don't serve the game's artistic intentions. There is no universal law of video games that demands a title meet a certain threshold of actionable mechanics to justify its presence in a storefront. What's a lot more instructive is to swap out the medium you're primarily comparing it to. From a video game's lens, it's easy to see what forms of interactivity were left out. From the lens of theater and performance arts, the interactivity Kentucky Route Zero has in its format as a video game allows it an enviable amount of flexibility. There are a lot of experimental plays and self-conscious one-act plays that strive to incorporate the audience and make them part of the ongoing performance, but it's almost always an incomplete or frustratingly basic conclusion because live audiences pose such challenges. A large audience, and it's hard to coordinate any involvement. An invitation to participate yields messy and awkward results if the participant is unenthusiastic, hostile, or worse, so excited to be there that they cling to the limelight beyond what's asked of them. There is no easier moment to see this flexibility than the interval in which Kentucky Route Zero is a traditional stage play. For 40 straight minutes, a one-act interlude called The Entertainment that falls between game acts 2 and 3. The Entertainment is available in a format compatible with a virtual reality headset for full immersion into the production. You don't have any dialogue or any blocking, so don't even sweat that. You're a character in the play called Barfly, and your only role is to get drunk, listen to the people around you, and find yourself too alienated to participate until the climax when it's too late for any of the characters. Except you're also you, the audience you, the player you. The video game format, especially if you add in the virtual reality element, allows this otherwise traditional stage play to do something almost completely unworkable in a live medium, to invert the theater in the round to a single point surrounded entirely by stage and characters. Looking across the stage's fourth wall into the audience in The Entertainment, you find it's populated entirely by other characters, the minor cast of the game who orbit on the outside of Conway's quest for 5 Dogwood Drive. As Kentucky Route Zero notes time and time again, artists have to get paid somehow. No performance that could accommodate an audience of just one and one alone is sustainable. The creative automation video games allow for as a medium, by affording the possibility of building that set, staging that scene individually across an unlimited number of screens, while still preserving all the original intended pacing and production cues, is just extremely fucking cool from a theatrical perspective. A problem with talking about video games is that it tends to be insular, so something like a 40-minute stage play in between more interactive portions seems to beg the question, why is this a game at all? When simply looking at it, even for a moment, from the perspective of a live production, illuminates a dozen artistic choices only made possible through the choice to be in an interactive digital medium. Like much of the rest of Kentucky Route Zero, The Entertainment is intensely metatextual and self-deconstructive. On the one hand, you have deliberately slow series of conversations between groups of bar patrons as everyone waits for a couple of musicians, Junebug and Johnny, to show up. The conversation flows around and around in hazy circles, always circling back to the subject of debt and the feeling that this kind of interminable waiting and living in the red will eventually have a reckoning at the end, which is exactly what happens. It falls into a tradition and a rhythm that's easily as old as Conway's truck. It toys with references and connections to Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, but the kind of deliberate weirdness of it all connects it the strongest to Sam Shepard in my mind. Whatever point of reference you take, the game has already accounted for the audience using academic comparisons, using its own references almost like bait it knows you can't resist taking. The entertainment uses the 360-degree audience perspective to pivot between the three walls of the play's narrative and the other three walls of the critical academic errata surrounding the play. You'll read snippets of reviews and criticism about certain scenes as those scenes unfold. You'll read interviews with the also-fictional author. You'll find every single sound cue in the production for each of the play's three short internal acts listed by name on a jukebox instead of actual songs. It is a play, with a layer of play, about a place you'll visit in the next act and people you'll meet there, which makes it kind of not a play, because as far as the game's Act 3 is concerned, it's nonfiction, except it still is a play and functions perfectly fine as one independent of anything Conway does in his story, while still mirroring the broader message of the entire work. Key in the production is that there are no voiced lines, and the art style never gives detailed faces to anyone in any interlude or act. The actual experience is further muddied from theater down into literature, reading script, not witnessing actual performances. The inclusion of all the background information in the walls 4 through 6 portion of the stage adds to that. You could try to approach it from a traditional academic perspective or a straightforward critical perspective, but the work itself has already taken both these perspectives and satirized them the very moment something even comes up. One built-in review calls some performances, which you can't hear, tepid and uninspired, but concedes that you, the barfly with no dialogue, was perfectly cast. It's a diss on the player that has to trickle down through like 7 layers of academic pretense to reach you. It's amazing. The narrative between walls 1 and 3 is mostly about Conway and his eventual fate, but the one between walls 4 and 6 is mostly about secondary character Lula Chamberlain and the constellation of feral academics who surround her. It is a deeply important interlude, but so odd in form and slow in pacing that I imagine not a lot of people were truly in the mood for it when it came up. If you're in this camp, I recommend giving it another try when you do feel in the mood, now that you know what you're in for with it. I've seen some comments that go, there's no difference to just watching it on YouTube, about Kentucky Route Zero generally, but about the entertainment in particular. I could not disagree more. Although the interactivity is limited, the production static, being present and alone in Barfly's chair at the edge of the stage is a critical component of what makes the whole thing theater. It is still live. You're just the only live one there, actor and audience both, in a theater of the surround. The entertainment is a tragedy, but I reckon you knew that was going to be the case. Harry, the bartender, only has one drink left to sell, Hard Times whiskey. The bar hasn't been doing well, and the patrons often can't afford to pay. Over the course of the play, you'll hear all of the details of the multivarious hardships they experience. The details don't end up mattering so much because Harry's been keeping a secret. All of those debts, the whole play shows us that each debt is really a story of disappointment or regret or a bad choice. Something that took a piece of these people that they never got back, in impoverishment of the self as much as the checkbook. By telling Harry these stories and drinking his whiskey night after night after night, Harry ended up holding all of these debts. So he sold them all, which is something that absolutely happens in real life. If you've ever been in collections, your file is essentially swapped and sold and traded speculatively on the strength of what different collection companies think they might be able to squeeze out of you. The Hard Times distillery leans more towards magic than realism, but their role in the story is realistic indeed. With Harry holding the debts, they were safe. He was a human. He'd treat them with compassion, even if he'd grouse about doing it. The company, however, will not. To them, it's business. The climax of the entertainment isn't the entertainment ever arriving, but instead the Hard Times Liquor Company calling to collect. Over the next few acts, their business model becomes clear. Well, as clear as anything along the Zero ever is. Once you owe them, they offer you a job to work it off. Once you accept, they separate spirit from body. As a glowing skeleton figure, your soul will labor indefinitely and fruitlessly against the interest your debt accrues for the rest of eternity. Your body, meanwhile, will be planted in the ground to flavor the liquor. It's fascinating how slowly, carefully the creative seeds of this concept are planted and cultivated. In Act 1, at the very beginning, you hear a crash up on the interstate. If you go there after sunset, when your journey's begun, there's a lot of debris in the headlights, but barely visible, off in the darkness, are coffins. In Act 2, the boys from the Hard Times distillery are described in fearful, uncertain terms. The end of the entertainment is when you see one of the boys for the first time, the last unspoken image of the play. In Act 3, you see the distillery from 2 sides. Above ground, it's a crumbling church and a graveyard, except all the headstones refer to batch number and list flavor highlights. You see this as two other characters, the boy Ezra and the long-awaited Junebug, while Conway and Shannon Marquez from Act 1 go into the distillery. Later in the act, at the very end, you see it from their perspective, an underground factory tour for Conway's benefit, because that crash back in Act 1 caused the Hard Times distillery to lose a driver, and Conway, well, he is well qualified. Not only as a truck driver, but as a lost soul. All through the acts, Conway's drifted into regret over his alcoholism and the consequences that it's caused. He's been dry for a little while, but it's hard to say if that'll stick. At the conclusion of the tour, he's offered his first shift drink. The player's control is taken away. Conway wants it. There's nothing a player can do about that. He tries then to refuse the job, but can't. That was top-shelf stuff, very expensive. His drinking had cost him, time and time again, but this time it's final, because now they own his debt. And whoever owns your debt owns your story, as it's been in America since the first ships arrived, bearing not just goods and people, but people as goods. In 1832, an English woman named Frances Trollope wrote a travel book called Domestic Manners of the Americans that was, let's say, unflattering. What's remarkable is how some of her better-known observations still apply 188 years down the line. Nearly 2 centuries ago, she wrote, quote, "Had I, during my residence in the United States, observed any single feature in their national character that could justify their eternal boasts of liberality and love of freedom, I might have respected them, however much my taste might have been offended by what was peculiar in their manners and custom. But it is impossible for any mind of common honesty not to be revolted by the contradictions in their principles and practice. You will see them with one hand hoisting the cap of liberty, and with the other flogging their slaves. You will see them 1 hour lecturing their mob on the indefeasible rights of man, and the next driving from their homes the children of the soil, whom they are bound to protect by the most solemn treaties." End quote. Kentucky Route Zero does not directly address slavery's legacy in the South, so much as it focuses with a laser precision on those contradictions of principle and practice. Although the Civil War ostensibly settled the issue of slavery, issues surrounding commodification of human lives has been a struggle for every decade and every generation of American society. Things constantly shift into new configurations and shapes, but something that has never left American culture is the idea that a person's self and being can be easily assigned a dollar amount, that people can be categorized into the worthy and worthless by ledger book alone. Throughout the 19th and early 20th century, American industrial expansion was fueled by working conditions that were hostile and hazardous, jobs for which the pay was almost non-existent. Rural conditions led to the rise of company towns, where the cost of living was generally just barely higher than the wages of the miners or mill workers, making sure that they lived in an eternal cycle of debt and no money given to the workers ever really left company circulation. Sometimes they would be paid in scrip that was literally useless outside of that company town. Even today, the practice of paying workers less than it takes to afford rent, food, and other necessities is a key part of many corporate business models. Living in poverty in America means living without control of your life, without certainty or safety. The job you have is the job you need, because otherwise everything you worked for is in jeopardy, whatever possessions, whatever savings, whatever stability. So people find themselves in positions of being paid less than they need to survive, doing work that'll probably kill them because something is better than nothing. American freedom is a complex, inconsistent thing because, on paper, everyone has quite a bit of it. In practice, most people are hanging from a thin thread above a dark and yawning abyss. Every month we try, and try again next month, until those months have worn your body to wrinkles and stubs and stained your hair to gray. I said I sure would hate to do this job all my life, and damn it, that's just what I've gone and done, as Snyder's farmer put it. It's easy to miss some details, but there is a deeper story behind Conway and Lizette of Lizette's Antiques. They used to be in love, once, when they were young, except he started drinking, started drifting, and some years later, when his new boss Ira was introducing him to his wife, that wife was Lisette. Conway didn't say anything at all in that instance, and now Ira's gone and Lisette's Antiques is going under. This is the last delivery. You might think, well, he'd go back to Lisette, but that bridge is burnt. Ira and Lisette had a kid, a good one, named Charlie. He and Conway did odd jobs together, Charlie working his way through college at the time. One day, Conway wakes up drunk, too drunk to do a roofing job, so Charlie goes instead. He slips, falls, dies. Conway flashes back once to talking to Lisette about it in the morning before the delivery. She says it's no one's fault, that's why they call it and then lets the player choose. You can choose accident, tragedy, or shame. All are true to how Conway feels. All are true of the situation. None of them, besides shame, matter against the guilt that Conway feels. His drinking took him away from Lisette, closed that future off to him, and whether he meant to or not, it took Lisette's future from her too in a late-life surprise. All that's left between them is a rotting old box truck full of antique furniture and a debt of regret that he will never pay off. Debt that the Hard Times Distillery is more than happy to take on. It's a key part of the artistic criticism. Not that corporations are inherently evil, but that they largely exist to prey on and profit from people who have made mistakes, who are lost and confused, who are barely scraping by on the margins of society. A 2018 Forbes article noted that in 2017, banks collected a total of $34 billion from overdraft and non-sufficient funds fees. The Forbes article, in typical financial advice style, puts the criticism on you for being charged in the first place. It concludes, "The bottom line is, try and avoid overdraft fees in the first place. Revisit how much you should keep in your checking account to ensure you always have a decent buffer. Sometimes you're so stressed about saving enough or paying down debt that you don't leave yourself enough to cover all your bills. If that's the case, you might have to rethink how you budget your take-home pay." This is common wisdom here in the US for the most part, that banks making actual billions of dollars in profit from people who, by definition, frequently have no money and no savings at all is pretty normal, and it's frankly your fault for not having better understood the order in which to pay your creditors. Or take an event that very much influenced Kentucky Route Zero in the first place, the subprime mortgage crisis and Great Recession around 2007. The entire concept behind subprime lending is that you sell houses to people who cannot afford them, with an eye to eventually taking the house back and pocketing all the myriad fees associated with the family's financial implosion. When lenders found that many of these people truly had no money, not even to pay all the penalty fees, the bubble burst. There was an expectation of financial predation on the corporation's part, but they had already picked all the bones clean and found themselves starving. Later on in Act 4, you meet a switchboard operator working in the flooded darkness of a buried train station, and over the course of your conversation, she explains how she's supposed to be training an automated system, but in explaining it, realizes she's just doing all the work of everyone who is fired, forgotten down here, trapped by her own financial obligations into staying on. She has a coworker, but he was fired long ago. His position is both voluntary and delusional. Cycles of debt intensify and worsen. Cycles of decay. Everything gets smaller, cheaper, older. All the antique grandeur and glory is lost in the humid darkness. In Tracy Lett's 2009 play August, Osage County, a character named Barbara is drinking whiskey and talking to Johanna, the housekeeper. She says, "One of the last times I spoke to my father, we were talking about, the state of the world or something, and he said, this country was always a whorehouse, but at least it used to have some promise. Now it's a shithole." And I think now maybe he was talking about something else, something more specific, something more personal to him. This house, this family, his marriage, himself? I don't know. But there was something sad in his voice, or no, not sad, he always sounded sad, something more hopeless than that. As if it had already happened, as if whatever was disappearing had already disappeared, as if it was too late, as if it was already over and no one saw it go. This country, this experiment, America, this hubris, what a lament if no one saw it go. Here today, gone tomorrow. Dissipation is actually much worse than cataclysm. End quote. In Kentucky Route Zero, we take the opposite approach to Barbara's father, with the exact same intonations. Here, the text is alive with the personal of marriages, families, houses, and selves, and all of it is really talking about the more general, the state of the world, the weariness of living in a place where we are all promised the pursuit of happiness, but are instead sold that happiness at varying payment plans. In Act 4, after the shift drink, Conway continues drinking, and we never control him as a character again. He seems to be drifting away. In that flooded train station with the switchboard, the boys from the distillery catch up with Conway. He is now fully a skeleton, like them, and gently floats away from the audience without a word of goodbye. As the audience, we wanted more for him, from him, to quit drinking and to heal the wounds in himself. Conway tried. He tried as best he could. Later you can tell Ezra either he left or they took him. Either is true. Both. Accident, tragedy, or shame. What's done is done, and the fact is that Conway wants to pay off his debt, even if he never can. He's crushed by it, as it is. So he leaves. Or they take him. And they take him. Down the tunnel into receding darkness, and what a lament that no one saw him go. What really differentiates Kentucky Route Zero from the literature and theater that came before it is its constant incorporation of academia as a kind of parasitic layer on top of the more classical American decay that we follow in Conway's plot thread. For example, Act 2 climaxes with Conway's attempt to find a doctor for his leg, except that the entire town has been bulldozed to make way for a museum, the Museum of Dwellings. The former townsfolk still live there, but as exhibits, something to be abstracted and labeled and fussed over. In the dead of night, a giant bird named Julian moves all the dwellings back to the woods where the people can live without scrutiny. But Julian brings the houses back every day because the museum is the only employer now that the town's been leveled. It is extremely peculiar. Or what about the Radovensky Institute, which you run across in Act 4? You can make a little money running behavioral test for university students, but none of the results could possibly tell you any of the things they're testing for. It's really no different than scrying the disemboweled guts of a ferret to try to tell the future, except that it has to be formatted as a grant proposal. There's a constant sense that in place of real places, real lives, there's just impressions in the dust that these things have left behind, infinitely measured and theorized over, while leaving the world blank of any meaningful replacement. On top of all the human sadness and disappointment in the entertainment was a chorus of voices arguing whether those sadnesses were effectively or movingly portrayed, what they alluded to, what tradition of sadness this is, and whether enough tribute was paid to the folks who popularized and canonized those particular flavors of sadness. It is especially intriguing as a creative choice because of the nature of Kentucky Route Zero's multimedia approach that invites all these sorts of comparisons and analysis in the first place. It over and over introduces us to characters who are trying to make sense of their situations and lives by extensively footnoting and annotating those lives, by grasping on to the legitimacy of known artists and art scholarship to validate the confusion of feelings they suffer in their interior world. It's extremely interesting to read what other people have written about Kentucky Route Zero as a game, because each set of references that the author brings to the table are unique to them. One YouTube review I saw talked about a museum exhibit they saw once. Another leaned heavily into connecting Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman to the work. Another one seized on the trio of bluegrass musicians who pop up from time to time as a kind of Greek chorus and tried to look at the game through the lens of classical theater instead of modern theater. I'm pretty insistent that this game's writing follows in Sam Shepard's tradition, but I'm also fond of that playwright and familiar with him, so of course on some level he was going to come up for me. There are so many artists and so many artistic threads that tie different works together in the world that a full critical accounting of a piece of art or an artist begins to resemble the butterfly effect. If a butterfly flapping its wings one place drastically alters the events of another in a chaotic tangle of causality, how to ever fully account for a person's artistic expression when it's formed by paintings whose artist's name they never learned, and commercial jingles, and a billboard they saw once, and 3 seasons of CSI Miami, and the collected works of Stanley Kubrick, and the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever, and the way the light came in the window of their first apartment, and the sound of a train in the distance, and the way the Pepsi logos changed since they were a kid. A very, very intense work of scholarship is an attempt to understand something as comprehensively as possible. In the STEM disciplines, this can lead to success. In the fine arts, however, you always run up against the fact that we are unknowable in many ways, even to ourselves. The best one can hope for is to persuasively argue context, to say these things flow together and make sense together, and there's a satisfying pattern to be found there. For the characters of Kentucky Route Zero, academia has failed them the way religion fails some people, who wake up one day with the lonely certainty that no one was ever watching at all. Joseph, the gas station attendant who Conway meets in Act 1, Scene 1, is one of those people. Him, a fellow named Donald, and a woman named Lula Chamberlain were all very close once, working on a very special kind of computer. That computer is called a Xanadu, and you find it during Act 3. Donald's been working on it this whole time, building it year by year in a cave called the Hall of the Mountain King, his work illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a burning stack of electronics that end up in the cave, discarded from the world above. He's got a little posse of research assistants and graduate students, all of whom have given up their lives to live in the cave, a kind of primitive and shamanistic life in service of high technology. Xanadu, however, is a flawed creation. Its only purpose is nostalgic melancholy, to look back on what's happened and to use the computer's talent for predictive, speculative world-building to pretend his life might have gone another direction. You can't miss Xanadu, but Donald isn't the only one who's made his regret and pain into a computer program. Lula and Joseph each have their very own gamified version of the same fundamental scene, the scene where the 3 of them part ways in the underground labyrinth of the Zero. Joseph went back up to the surface, restless, listless. His game sits hidden in a museum in an archival stack, never to be played or seen again. Lula stayed along the Zero, got an office job. She settled. Her game ended up in a gallery showing of a collection of her art, which makes up the interlude between Acts 1 and 2. Donald went down, went deeper, went truly feral, and his game is at once the most complex and the most useless of all of them. Like Kentucky Route Zero's plot in general, it only gives the illusion of being able to alter the outcome. Xanadu's great predictive powers only tell the future once, to predict that Lula will return the moment before she does. Its win state was simply to return to the present. The game within a game of Xanadu is itself another moment of academic reference. It's modeled on and opens almost identically to the 1976 game Colossal Cave Adventure, the first ever work of interactive fiction. It was a foundational work, and the references to it are every bit as deliberate, important, and academic as all the Eugene O'Neill references earlier. Colossal Cave Adventure and its sorrowful echo Xanadu tie together more metatextual strings of influences. Colossal Cave Adventure is based in part on Mammoth Caves in Kentucky, where its developer did computer mapping projects. It's an imaginative, fantastical exploration of an actual place. In an interview, one of Kentucky Route Zero's developers talked about how a computer in the home he grew up in had Colossal Cave Adventure installed on it, and one of the text options in Xanadu is even based on a moment he and his dad had with the game together. Xanadu is equal parts a tribute to the forerunner of the entire concept of a digital interactive storytelling space, a memory personal to the developer, a memory personal to 3 of the characters, a reference to a place that exists in Kentucky, a reference to a place that exists in Kentucky, and a meditation on how it's futile to expect technology to fix us because our own flaws and failings carry over to our creations. Kentucky Route Zero is so self-consciously dense that it's easy to feel lost in all the different layers of meaning, easy to have difficulty in sorting out which connections are frivolous and which are meaningful. Except all these layers are no different really than the dialogue. Pick the one that feels right to you. There is no invalid choice. Conway was supposedly the main character, but he slips away wordlessly toward the end of Act 4, never to reappear again. If the game is willing to reprioritize and swing away from Conway like that, how attached could it possibly be to its more obviously tangential or supplementary elements? You just have to let the feeling of the road trip portion of the game carry over to the more esoteric and hard-to-parse sections, to just let the road take you where it's going, and not worry so much about being lost. In Sam Shepard's True West, one of the 2 main characters goes feral in the same kind of way that Donald or Joseph did. He manically begins to throw away everything he had to live the life of his drifter brother, to his brother's extreme annoyance. Lee, the drifter, says, "What are you, crazy or something? You went to college? Here you are, down here, rolling at bucks, floating up and down in elevators, and you want to learn to live on the desert." To which Austin, the city slicker, replies, "I do, Lee. I really do. There's nothing down here for me. There never was. When we were kids, it was different. There was a life here then, but now I keep coming down here thinking it's the 50s or something. I keep finding myself getting off the freeway at familiar landmarks that turn out to be unfamiliar, on the way to appointments, wandering down streets I thought I recognized that turn out to be replicas of streets I remember. Streets I misremember. Streets I can't tell if I lived on or saw on a postcard. Fields that don't even exist anymore. There's nothing real down here, Lee. Least of all me." End quote. The underground world of the Zero isn't some big rock candy mountain-esque escape from the real world where things are better. Things along the Zero are often as sad and as dire as the world above. It's just that those things that were real but now feel off, the misremembered streets and unfamiliar landmarks, those gone-away things have fragmented off of broader reality and come to rest along the Zero. Take the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces, where Lula works. It's a cathedral, or was, until it was reclaimed as an office building. The congregation that was here has been transferred to a storage facility alongside some archived documents. The bureaucracy that's moved into the old religious space is pretty normal and not necessarily malevolent, just purposeless and self-justifying. They can't even blot out or cover up the whimsy of the place, like how the elevator's 3rd floor is marked bears, and, well, there you go. In place of gargoyles are televisions playing strange short loops that the receptionist nevertheless still refers to as grotesques. Above, in a pretty well-hidden alcove visible from the 2nd floor, is a pipe organ. A man in colorful shorts and a sweater will play strange music on it and then let the quiet rush back in. This is Will. Will is actually one of the more vividly presented characters because he's got a voice. He operates the Bureau of Secret Tourism, which isn't that much of a thing. They print some brochures and they operate an automated phone line. Calling into the phone line is the entire interlude between Acts 3 and 4. Will details each point of interest along the Echo River in the upcoming act, even the town where Act 5 takes place, the town with Dogwood Drive. He has a kind of gentle, wizardly drawl, which he uses to great effect describing the sights. His voice is kind of slow and kind of sad. He chooses his words so deliberately that the effort seems to exhaust him. With this voice established, Will narrates the entirety of Act 4 and ferries you along in the past tense. He and a woman named Kate pilot Conway and the group along the Echo River to Lake Lethe. Act 4 takes away your freedom of travel at the same time it takes away Conway as a playable character, in the same motion that it shifts you from present to past tense. At 10 consecutive stops, you can either stay in the boat or go ashore. If you stay, Will describes what happens to the characters who went ashore. If you go, Will tells the story of other travelers and other sites. Will is, in many ways, one of the only characters who is truly content with who he is and how he's lived. He's achieved this peace by giving up possessions, giving up home, surrendering to the loop. His world is junk and ruin, but he's done a better job making sense of it than any of the other academic characters by giving up on mastery and settling for faithful observation. It doesn't matter to Will that the Zero is a place of unreliable, magical dimensions, that it exists between reality and imagination. What matters is that he feels real to himself down here in this realm where a gone-away memory and a forgotten street might be more misplaced than gone forever. For him, the Bureau of Reclaimed Spaces is still very much a cathedral to be filled with thankful music. The academics in the cast far outnumber the working stiffs, even in cases like Joseph's, where he qualifies for either bracket. If you come back to Joseph at the gas station after leaving on your quest for the Zero in Act 1, you'll find him talking to a man named Carrington, the most eccentric of all the academic characters. His subplot forms a kind of tertiary frame for the entire story, to the point that the final interlude is the climax to Carrington's obsessive pursuits. If you never find him in Act 1, though, the whole plotline stays dormant. It isn't critical at all to a playthrough. My first time through the games, I completely missed it, and everything landed equally as well. That's because the game has been a tragedy from the beginning. It emotionally succeeds best in the places where its delicate bleakness is sharpest. Carrington is absent for and escapes pretty much all of that, with the tonal twist being that this escape allows the epilogue to take a more hopeful note than you might expect. It all comes down to the kind of academic Carrington represents. He's not of the sciences, he's a theater man, in the loudest possible way. The man carries a set of antlers with him wherever he goes, for God's sake. He wants to stage a highly experimental performance of the Robert Frost poem Death of the Hired Man. The main game works okay without this subplot because, on the one hand, Kentucky Route Zero honestly has enough layers of self-conscious artistic reference to paint the mosaic it was trying to paint. It doesn't necessarily need another. Except that Act 5 is the least concrete, the most emotionally abstract and powerful of the acts. It resolves itself, sure, but with delicate and determined ambiguity. Like a poem, it's structured to provoke a response, not narratively conclude in a traditional way. By the time we get to Act 5, a lot of what the game is trying to say is beyond explicit statements and summary, matters of mood and impression and color, where once we had a black and white with words on top. There can't be any kind of epilogue to such an open-ended structure that doesn't necessarily comment on or lend a preference to one kind of interpretation or another. Carrington's epilogue sidesteps this entirely by focusing on the concrete details of his own personal arc. Act 5 provokes a million questions. Carrington only has to respond to, "How'd your play turn out, man?" It's the player's play, too, in a lot of ways. Throughout the first 3 acts, Carrington turns to Conway, and the player, to answer the questions of where to stage the production, and encourages the whole main cast of the game to turn up in the audience. You've had input, so you've got a stake in the success. Besides, it's clearly a meta kind of way to have a chat about how the game went down now that it's over. From one perspective, the play was a failure. No one actually showed up. No audience, no actors. It just never really happened at all. Carrington had said this project was the culmination of a decade of work and study. It was important to him, critical to him, to his perception of himself and his conception of his soul. And it's not that he was deliberately snubbed either. I believe that Conway meant to show up. Stuff kind of came up for him, though. For everyone. Everyone's path took them in divergent directions. No insult to art, just that the living of life often takes precedence over the artistic deconstruction of it. So Carrington slinks back to Harry's bar, where the janitor from Act 2's storage facility, who was on a payphone in Act 4, comes back in to try to get some work and make some money. In discussing the janitor's situation and the merits of charity in his case, each character, Harry and Carrington, mirrors attitudes and whole lines from the Robert Frost poem. The original Death of a Hired Man has an old couple who run a farm debating whether to take in an even older hand who's past his prime, knowing he won't really be able to do the job, whether it lets him preserve his dignity or whether everyone involved will find him a burden. In the poem, the hired man dies before the conversation is even resolved. Surely, the same in Kentucky Route Zero, right? It's a sad game, so of course it'll go 1-for-1 with the poem. Except, it doesn't. In the moment where the janitor would be dead, he's alive, just asleep. Schrodinger's hired man. It's a hopeful note, more comprehensively optimistic the more you examine it. Not only does life not always imitate art, but art doesn't always imitate art. Our conclusions are chaotic and uncertain, but that uncertainty can be a positive force. Carrington got to have his highly experimental theatrical production of the poem anyway, while the player is busy flipping TV channels behind Harry's bar. Harry is a bit of a villain in the story of Kentucky Route Zero, but he's just a guy. He doesn't have the energy or the emotional range to be wholly villainous. There's a sliver of kindness in the man. In the end, that sliver changed the outcome of Carrington's art. Changing Carrington's art subverted the quiet despondency of the poem. In subverting the poem's despondency, it soothes the nihilistic edges of the game's broader writing. It's not a happy ending, but it's a kinder one than Kentucky Route Zero was leading you to believe you'd get. I don't think I'd have felt the same way about Act 5 without it. 3.5 years went by between the releases of Acts 4 and 5, and then when Act 5 did come out, it was a little less than an hour long. In a lot of ways, however, it is the most difficult and dense of all the acts. Acts 1 through 3 really did function similar enough to a traditional adventure game, with a narrative that was fragmentary but roughly sensible. Act 4 started to heavily deviate. The interludes are all massive deviations, but Act 5 is so wildly different and makes such daring presentational choices that it feels like something else entirely. Which it is. Act 5 is no longer in an adventure game format, but returns to the theater of the surround format that they had in the entertainment interlude. At the end of Act 4, it's been decided that everyone will finish Conway's delivery without him, abandoning the faithful old truck at the bottom of a great spiral staircase. The tube that staircase pops out of is your fixed perspective position for the Act 5, suspended hundreds or maybe thousands of feet above Conway's now empty truck. Around you is a town without roads and a cenote, a circular depression in the landscape. Surrounding the tunnel is an ancient earthwork mound, a legacy of the civilizations that came before and vanished. On top of and around that mound are the eclectic houses and small businesses of a once thriving artists' colony on the verge of being abandoned following a catastrophic flood. The cast of this act is huge. Not just whoever's left from Conway's group, but many new characters introduced in this act or the previous interlude, The People of Nothing. Rather than choose a character to focus on, your eye-in-the-sky perspective puts you at a distance from all of it. You're given a cat and a firefly to control. Move the input, move the firefly, and the cat follows. Occasionally, you'll be prompted to meow, and that makes a character react to you. The act progresses across a whole day, from a beautiful and bright morning sunshine to a pensive and melancholy sunset. Time moves forward as you listen to conversations all around town between surprising assortments of characters. When you've listened to something and turned your back, the blocking changes, characters resetting to a new scene position. The most significant thing about these sweeping changes is how they create a sense of emotional distance and detachment on top of the physical distance. The cat's the perfect symbol for it. Friendly, curious, but transient in people's lives, independent of them, to the point of not even speaking the language. Your dialogue choices, as a cat, are represented by a looping wire symbol that gets more twisty the longer the cat yowls. It's cute. As far as human dialogue choices go, you're making some of the most lasting and significant choices you've ever made for these characters. For most of the characters you care about, and many of the ones who are mostly strangers to you, like Emily, Ben, and Bob, the Bluegrass Trio, there's an option to stay in the town and help rebuild, or to leave. However, these conversations happen so casually, just conversational asides where the characters are really just thinking out loud, not having known themselves how they feel about things until they've said it. No epilogue follow-up is done. You don't choose their futures in a traditional RPG kind of way, so much as you declare their intentions in an official co-author capacity. What feels right? As the day goes on and these choices are made, the house at 5 Dogwood Drive fills up with the antique furniture Conway was carrying. As the house is being filled, a grave is being dug. The day progresses at a pace as languid as the weather, warm and sleepy, no sense of rush or urgency. You wouldn't think any of these choices would manage to add up to anything that feels climactic, choices to mute and distance the emotions, choices to elongate and slow the pacing, choices to dilute the interactions with known characters by giving equal attention, maybe even more attention, to the unknown characters. Except these choices do cohere, wrapping up together in a loop as tightly and strongly bound as the steel radial belts of a long faithful tire. How well, after all, do you really know these characters? Shannon Marquez has been with you the longest after Conway's exit from the stage, but how much of her life's history and life's ambitions are actually known to you, the player, the reader, the audience? Little. More than you know of a character like Emily, perhaps, but not a lot more at all. The emotional and spatial distance in Act 5 is being used to critically deconstruct your sense of ownership and connection to these characters. Even the text appears over the characters' heads, far away from your camera's perspective, little dots of people and little boxes of text saying things that are significant in a way that feels muted, like you're truly overhearing things and not remotely participating. And it's not just the people who are people. As a cat in a magical realist world, you're able to see the ghosts of the ghost town, to witness little events and scenes from people long dead who made this place a home. These stories are every bit as valid and vivid as the ones that the game has been pursuing so far with the characters you know, and there aren't even names or faces attached to the ghost encounters. You could say this is indicating the focus of the story doesn't matter, or that the story itself is without purpose, but it seems more clear and hopeful than that to me. Rather than diminishing the value of your connections, it's putting those connections into context with history and the erosions of time. What we are, and what people mean to us, the little moments that are so powerful and the big moments that pass in an instant, these fade as we are forgotten. Except our contributions to the churning chaos of humanity have an impact. They last. Our loves and our hatreds leave behind traces just as surely as the gas stations that go bankrupt and rot by the side of the road. There's only diminishment if you take it for granted that these characters are special just because we pay attention to them, and that those we ignore are somehow less human just because we don't know the details of their humanity. It is certainly true that authors in any medium must pick and choose who to focus on, and some characters are, by design, very slight outlines of people, but that's ignoring that this mimics the fact that our own lives are very much governed by who we choose and don't choose to pay attention to, who counts as a stranger, and how that changes over time. After all, even the main cast of this game only have what are supposed to be hours of time together. It makes it quite easy to have these characters decide to go instead of to stay. It makes their dilemma pronounced, because in the absence of a clear happy ending, it's possible they were happy enough as they were and don't need to settle down. Being a friend, or being a stranger, or even the past or present question of alive or dead, has no bearing on anyone's depth of humanity. Those things are resolutely individual to anyone who's ever lived. Act 5 deliberately short-circuits the basic assumption that this story is about its characters. Instead, it's about how we've seen them, what it means to have listened to them, and tried to understand the often confusing, contradictory things they've said, or could have said. The audience is no more than a cat, pawing and meowing and hoping it provokes a response. We are not above these characters because we've controlled them, nor do we truly know them just because we find them familiar. The act climaxes with a funeral, but not for Conway, not for anyone you've known, or even for humans. It ends with a funeral for 2 horses called the neighbors, who drowned in the storm. It's a sad scene, but it's hard to immediately connect with because of who's being buried. A horse funeral seems at once mundane and peculiar. They die all the time and are mourned often, but we don't often give these deaths any weight. Like, perhaps, how easy it is to ignore a figure like Conway, who lives in the world, works in it, struggles in it, and passes from it, without meeting any conventional metrics of success. There are farms, so there are farm animals. They live, they die. It is always so. So, where there are trucks, there are truck drivers, so on down the line, for every invisible pillar that holds the foundation of this country out of the mud. One mourner for the horses regrets not giving them names, just the neighbors, just horses. They didn't seem like they needed names at the time, but now that they're gone, their individuality and uniqueness is keenly felt. After the eulogies, a song. Slow, beautiful, sad, a country hymn. It goes on for some time while ghosts begin to materialize as the camera pans out and up to show the horses in the ground. A small funeral becomes a huge one, wordlessly, all over and gone in the space of the hymn. I didn't feel the emotions of the scene at first, during the eulogies, but here what's being felt is larger, more inarticulate, a sorrow that's bigger than the horses, or the town, or any of the dozens and dozens of gone-away lives who come to welcome their new members and then disappear again. It was a sorrow that had been building all game long, within myself as well, and then it hit me, all at once, in a tremendous wave. I couldn't even explain the dimensions of the feeling. It was too large, too indistinct, like trying to describe where you are inside of cloud. That's what a poem does. It expresses those things. It uses words for things that are unspeakable, puts images to things that can't be seen. As the ending to a narrative story, Act 5 of Kentucky Route Zero is inconclusive, obtuse. As the ending to an epic poem about the beauty and the rot of American existence, it is sharply concise. To feel at the end here that there are things left unsaid is precisely the point. We never do all the things we need to. We never make it to all the places we want to go. Too soon, the storm comes down and drowns those few things that were still wild and blameless, leaving us to weakly apologize in the lengthening shadows of the day. Way back in Act 1, under the gas station, Conway meets Emily, Ben, and Bob while they play some kind of game with a 20-sided dice. The dice rolls off and Conway retrieves it, but the trio are vanished by the time he comes back. If you choose to pocket the dice, it is still in the jacket when Shannon wears it in Act 5. She gives Emily, Ben, and Bob the dice, and she teaches them that game in the first place. More, these characters are inside the TV studio when the flood destroys it during the interlude between Acts 4 and 5. Same for most of the newer characters of Act 5. Are they dead? Possibly. But that sort of thing matters very little on the Zero. The detail of the dice looping from Act 5 back to Act 1 again is significant because it demonstrates that the Zero is a loop in all ways, not just navigationally. Everything you've seen all journey long has been a jumble of eras, objects, artistic mediums, meanings. Nothing has ever gone along the Zero, just misplaced, which is both a comfort and a curse. One line from the Robert Frost poem that Harry and Carrington chew on for a while is, "Home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in." Harry the bartender disagrees with this conclusion. He says the only place where, when you have to go, they have to take you, is the grave. To pass through the underground world of the Zero and pop up again in the sunshine and color of a town with 100 ghosts and no roads certainly seems, in a way, like passing from one world to the next. It has the flavor of death to it. It's the way of the game, besides, for each choice to be equally valid, so having the grave and home be interchangeable answers to the riddle of where do you go where they have to take you is perfectly in keeping with all of the writing so far. There's also the extremely small, blink-and-you'll-miss-it detail of the instigating quest to find 5 Dogwood Drive not being specific to Conway at all. Twice, other characters will offhandedly remark that they too had received a request for furniture to be delivered to 5 Dogwood Drive. It was a form letter. Then there's the matter of the address itself. It's a house only in the most abstracted, formal sense of the word. It's a blank slate. It has little about it that seems human or individual. It's the idea of a house, much more than it's a house. So, on the one hand, these characters may belong there because, like so many other things along the Zero, they're just echoes. Our experience of them is fragmented because they're already gone, and fragments are what's left. When it comes to the grave, we all receive a letter, but not all of us go at once. It's deeply unclear all game long, for instance, whether Weaver Marquez is dead or not, but she places a heavy hand on the scales of fate for all these characters regardless of whether she is or isn't. On the other hand, after passing through the underground and finding the house that isn't a house, the characters spend the whole day of Act 5 making it a home. Each of the 3 main advancements of time throughout the act fills 5 Dogwood Drive with more and more of the antiques. Its blankness is wrestled into submission with memories, furniture, fabrics. The house could be anything at all. It's what's added to it that makes it a home. Notably absent from the list of answers about where you can go where they have to take you is Kentucky, or America more broadly. Whether 5 Dogwood Drive is home or the grave, its significance is personal. Its appeal is as a refuge from the broader world. Being a citizen of the United States is not, and has never been, a guarantee that they'll take you in when you have to go. It abides by the systemic cruelties that hurt its people, it ignores the things that it finds inconvenient, it allows the gap between American promise and American reality to wax and wane anew with every generation, but never close the distance. It is no wonder that Kentucky Route Zero leans so heavily into folk and gospel music, because so often that music touches on the inability of America to provide true stability or safety or meaning. Why else would we sing about how there's a better home awaitin' in the sky, Lord, in the sky, if we didn't have to struggle each month to pay rents and mortgages in Kentucky or Texas or California or wherever? It's easy to call Kentucky Route Zero an anti-capitalist work because it has that quality to it and touches on those themes, but the art of the game is much more delicate than that might suggest, grounded far more in the psychological, emotional damage that debt does to a person, and in the isolating quality of failing to succeed in the traditional American sense, than it is a dry weighing of economic merits. This contrasted with an addictive aspiration towards the American promise, the longing for it, the striving towards it, the sense that no matter how much a fable it seems, that it's only a paycheck or two away, and the problem must be within ourselves if we haven't grasped hold of it yet. It's almost a feeling of homesickness. In a 1940 essay for Vogue called Look Homeward, Americans, Carson McCullers wrote, quote, "It is a curious emotion, this certain homesickness I have in mind. With Americans it is a natural trait, as native to us as the roller coaster or the jukebox. It is no simple longing for the hometown or country of our birth. The emotion is Janus-faced. We are torn between a nostalgia for the familiar and an urge for the foreign or strange. As often as not, we are homesick the most for places we have never been." End quote. This is the power of the road narrative in American culture, its deepest and least articulated appeal, that there is peace in the journey because the destination might be illusory. I really do love this country, but what I love most about it are always the things that it's told me it wanted to be, and so much more rarely what it is in practice. Yet, I keep looking for America. I know it's here somewhere. If I can't find it on the freeways, I'll look on the byways, I'll look on the surface streets. If I can't find it there, I guess I'll just have to try the subsurface streets, the secret and forgotten roads where the past accumulates in dusty snowdrifts, and nothing stays lost forever. It doesn't matter if I never reach it. I can't help myself for looking, endlessly homesick, for a place I've never been. That's Kentucky Route Zero. Thanks for watching. This video and all the videos I do are only made possible through the crowdfunding website Patreon. I'd like to take a moment to thank by name some of the people who are currently donating $10 a month or more to make these videos possible. People like Avery Holmes, Eamon McNeely, Saab Akaduka, Lai Wujol, Austin Alosio, Talia Humke, Dylan Scott Isger, Evilbread, Jake Aronius, Umoria, Anders Berg Donas, Jeff Sang, Frederick Fitzpatrick, Ferez Atalia, KHD Maker, Julius Janikevicius, Rocco Giacomo, David Schuerman, Recon Mission, Kazra Fedausafard, Blind Fighting, Eric Sheps, Ted Lattis, Melody Redacted, Jacob Sindelar, Solid, Carter Kalchik, Martin Peterson, Cale Perrion, Comfy Hat, Alex Hansen, Leo Neal, Ethan Cossett, John Paul Queller, Aaron Williams, Andrew Hartnett, Zach Millington, Sohaib Sheik, Eddie Burton, Carol Henderson, Daniel Phillips, Tyler Robinson, Jeremy McQuaid, Corey Bofill, Eli Bergmans, Dennis Clark, Jake Mays, Kumaran Vijian, Nobody, World War II Freak, Alexander Leister, Igor Babiuk, Lars Braken, Morgan Moll, Brian Hill, Stephen Thompson, Julian Reno, Agandine, Jared Meyer, Genoshan, Stinson Sneed, Noton, Adam Alla, ICR7, Thomas Culligan, Ali Nuortimo, Ryan Barrow, Sidonia, Massive Ron Gervais, James Condon, Greg, Chris DeKenton, Evan Eggers, Perori, Vodka Blitz, Kirk Battle, Johnny Marsbar, Rusty Kelly, Jason Hine, Jason, Stephen Plovang, Agnes Cunningham, Oshi, Quitch, Sian Higgins, Eric Goose, Levi Thomas, Haste Guy, Hedgehog Kevin, Sean Sobey, Doom Sheridan, Jeremy Austin, Cody Peterson, Sophia Naylor, Alexander Smith, Konstantiv Ivarov, Ali Hamoud, Franz Laufke, Devona Uparak, Jed Kirk, Logan Hickman, Danston, Tyson Cox, JRG123, Liam White, Zachary Leonard Roper, Wolfen White Van, Sergeant QQ, Trinant, Penny Drake, Matthew Burns, Symmetry Master, 1MXW1, Conrad Klinkosh, James Hull, Louis Cernti, Tilts, Aaron Debsky-Budin, Matthias Campbell, Rogue Thrax, Keone Warby, Eli Young, Space Wizard 63, Arnie HD, Vivi, Maxwell Bone, Thomas Vavasour, Emma vs. Dracula, Peter Gronbach, Jay Calder, Tyler R. Smith, Alex McDonald, Ryan Park, Christopher Guile, Kevin Morris, Allison Sugar, Brianna Manassa, Mario Mendez, Dave, Alexander Clatworthy, Vadim Flax, Kyle Zims, Colin Stoltz, Nicholas, Quinn, Lucas Stalliard, Preston Michelizio, Coolboy John, Ottavio Albedisi, Ethan Hayes, Howard Knutson, Quinn Hannah White, Karu Huag, Peter H., Reese Kittleson, John Little, Scrub Lord, Darren Jackson, Eric Jensen, Phil Harding, Elijah King, Baxter Jr., Max Barris, Patrick Gaumond, Tyron Lambert, Gabriel Holland, Simon Hasselhoff, Patrick Mills, Mizko Siaha, Callum TM, Brendan Gelbert, Dralox 789, Dekub, Highland Fox, Well-Tempered Clavier, Zach Zykuski, Dan Pop, William Pavard, Queenan, Matthew Shryrock, Dragon Kobold, Ricky Shields, Asbjorn Vol Kvalbian, Owen Tierle, Cold Beans, Bob Mitchum, Tyler King, Mike W., Stephen Lovedance, Benjamin, Ivan Echeverria, Selowick, Cobra, Adam NH, Histoclop, Travis Houston, Alex Williams, William J. Gorman, Marky Marcus Aurelius, Layden Carden, James Henderson, Zachary Ziemba, Juju Beans, John Soklowski, Matthew Richard Twaibner, Austin Matheson, Scott Muck, SG Response, Tiernan Garces, Christopher Askin, James Gray, Victor Tumoli, Derek Melancon, Jared A. Hicks, Garrett Johnson, Han Jiping, Jacob Mwanish, Valerian, Psychodelicat, Max Cohen, Shieldwall, Leo Peril, Markaleth, Tyler F., Piperman, William Tung, Conceited Axis, Bryn Davies, Lawrence Hurley, James Mosca, Simon Anderson, Victor Felton, S. Engvall, Jeffrey McIntyre, Marcin Zarad, Zachary Berent, Levi Whitney, Dickian Delomast, Mr. Mush, Nikolai, Elijah Nelson, Sam Bellmeyer, Byron Callan, Colin Guti, Eric Amundsen, Noah Kantrowitz, Tinfoil Pancakes, Max Pantoja, Maurice Desero, Manu Weedman, Lo Beyonder, Galozin, Vance Jordan Falls, Ralph Rainwater, Alexander Romanov, Fyodor Kasperzik, Patrick McGranahan, Robot Ghost, Jeremy Saunders, Stephen Heim, Ryan Snyder, April, Jacob McMillan, Eric Joyner, Edward Clayton Andrews, Tim Dodds, Ian Gloscock, Dylan Ball, C.E. Keene, Mr. Pigeon, El Weasel, Werner Herzog, Connor McLeod, Daniel Orn Christensen, Thomas Lee, me, Nemo Vandenbrink, The Nikophorovs, Ben Wellard, J.S., Nick, Greg Mirles, Jordan Klein, Sky Jansen, Daniel Floyd, Mark Phillips, Andrew Tapp, Kevin Schaub, Matthew Sutton, Tizar Vicarian, David Carlson, Kissa, David Harpstrite, Matthew Mason, Josh, Obelisk Art History, Matthew Cassidy, Will Dobbins, Tom Rowerdink, Kyle Zahner, N.K. Jemison, Michael Atwell, Andrew Oplinger, I Cannot Fly, Dirk Warble, Nick Cole Hamilton, Galak, Brett Gyalmo, Oscar Stangenberg, Lars Ingvar Anderson, Colin, Adam Howard, Dewey, Aurelian, Andrew Boissonneau, Pascal Moret, Alexander Sunden, Zach B., Lasselas, Toad Hart, Thomas Whitty, Casey Pioli, Hercules Johnson, The Soul James, Fergus Foley, Argus Swift, Ryan Van Dyke, Daniel Barsh, Cybot D., Kim Winson, Andreas Larson, Anthony Bardill, Sean, Philip Coffey, Brian Pluckelman, Jesse Wilkison, Devin Fitzpatrick, Tim Marsh, Colin Bassnett, Jeanette N., Carl Gleason, Spooky Space Cook, Dios, Rich Stower, Adrian Komole, Nate Tenzar, Tom Painter, Simon Nearfalk, Sharif Kazemi, Jared Olzuski, Mr. Flacco, Eric Jepson, Dirk Warbrul, Q-Ray X, Alex Zalato, The Bloke, Brandon Boat, Stephen Garrett Day, Sasha Iya, Peter Flink, Krimgi Schlepeps, Jeno Shin, Michael de Michiel, Matthias Vanderbosch, Jared K., Matthew Allen Kelsey, Victor Nordstrom, Jack Shawham, Gustav Lyons Leodstadt, Grant Kelly Walker, Cole Davies, Thomas Watkins, The Drunken Manatee, Darius Riadomaner, Justin Michael, Liam Pierce, Nikolai Vladimirov, Clay Harrington, Kate Stock, Talia Humke, Grendel, Shazgu, Gaspard Fleury, Hurtabizi, Gamp, Greg Rucka, Amanda Kay, Samuel Murphy, Justin Michael, Chris Dobbs, Tom Vickers, Robin Mueller, Evan Barnett, The Rambling Bard, Steve Bellegarde, Daria, Armata, Pieface, Ryan Francom, Jeffrey Harris, ADC 400, Brandon Martin Silks, Sean Higgins, Timothy Lee Peterson, Rex Amit, 1MXW1, General Krang, Addy, BK, Martin Ashlam, Alexander Bjorn, Ricardo Gainda, Harrison Prusa, Joseph M., 20K Under the Sea, Texas Dan, Jack Roynane, Dylan Ball, Jay Mackery, Jonathan Faherty, Merrick Jones, Sean Yun, Alexander Toller, Jeremy Harris, Gethin Riss Binns, Sean Murphy, Tech, Daniel McCarthy, I'm sorry about that, Dominic Hickman, Miss MJ, Conceited Axis, Sam Zeitlin, Alex Fettigan, Colin McRae, Pendaroo, Kazuhira, Raven Rises, Christopher Clack, Dave Casson, Joe Freud, Peyton Helix, Aidan Henzel, Avery Thorpe, Andy, Simon Murray, Snowhole, James Sullivan, Brett Brothers, Adventure Top, Cato, Bailey Smith, Ryan Francom, Benjamin Glover, Hapchin95, Angelo Sakaras, Lander, James Brandon, Matthew, Custom, C, Kyle Parliament, Matt Leffler, Charlotte M3, Aldo Curtis, Florian Wiedemann, Stickman Grit, Eric Strickling, Commissar, John Fry, Nick Korosek, Avra Tavares, Bentley 109, Andy Benny, Rich to the Ardio, Daniel Ludwig, Gabriel Bernson, Daniel Zaux, Sky Swanson, Jonathan Harrison, Michael Hazami, Wheeler Niekirk, Ruben, Joseph Smith, The Demon Slayer, Daniel Sarosi, Aleski Ero Olavi, Philip Woolley, Epitome Zizi, Elizer Dorbin, Jimbo, Adam Finley, Jake Estes, Sam Birkland, Jim McGeehan, Michael Keatis, Finley M., Marcello Ferrara, Evan Hill, Dusty Gibraltar, Magnus Castleberg, Vivek Ragburn, Hot Kettle Water, Joe Joyce, Jack Holmes, Soldier Hawk, Hunter Rasmussen, Jarls, Lucas Marcondes de Mora, David Stapley, Sean Hansen, Dr. Crime, Oyvind Garberg, Alistair Stack, Beth Leuenberger, Smite Me Now, Andrew Sousa, Dorian Sanchez, Alara, and Aviscus, as well as the many others who are donating the smaller amount. I really appreciate it. It keeps these videos going. Thank you.